Which type of data structure should you use to optimize create, read, update, and delete CRUD operations for data saved in a multi-column tabular format? A relational database is the best option for CRUD operations and uses the least amount of storage space. A key/value store is used for simple lookups based on a single key to obtain a single value. A document database uses unstructured data such as JSON, and is optimized for retrieval, not CRUD operations. A graph database is used to store hierarchical data, such as organizational charts that have nodes and edges. You have data stored in two tables in a database. You create a relationship between the tables. Which type of data do you have? Data stored in two tables in a database with a relationship between the tables is an example of structured data. Which type of data should be sent from video cameras in a native binary format? Which type of data should be sent from video cameras in a native binary format? Unstructured data contains data such as documents, images, audio data, video data, and binary files. You need to aggregate and store multiple JSON files that contain records for sales transactions. The solution must minimize the development effort. Which storage solution should you implement? Azure Cosmos DB has a SQL API that is optimized to store and process, transform, JSON files. The SQL API allows you to query the documents by using SQL-like language. There is no additional learning curve here to complete the task. Azure Files is used as storage for any type of file. There are no built-in methods to query the file and aggregate data. Blob storage allows you to store any type of data. You must use Azure Synapse Analytics or Azure Databricks to be able to query and aggregate the data. Azure SQL Database is a relational database that keeps data in tables. You must create a process that queries the JSON files and stores them in a relational format. Which is the best type of database to use for an organizational chart? Graph databases are the best option for hierarchical data. Azure SQL Database is the best option for create, read, update, and delete CRUD operations and uses the least amount of storage space, but our solution does not require a database management system, DBMS. Object storage is the best option for file storage, not hierarchical databases. Table storage is not suited for files. Which type of database should you use to store sequential data in the fastest way possible? Time series databases are used to store sequential data. Table storage is not suited for time series. Graph databases are used to store hierarchical data, such as organizational charts that have nodes and edges. Azure SQL Database is the best option for create, read, update, and delete CRUD operations, uses the least amount of storage space, and is not optimized for time series. You design an application that needs to store data based on the following requirements: store historical data from multiple data sources, load data on a scheduled basis, use a denormalized star or snowflake schema. Which type of database should you use? OLAP databases are used for Snowflake schemas with historical data. Table storage is not suited for this type of data. Graph databases are used to store hierarchical data, such as organizational charts that have nodes and edges. OLTP databases are used for create, read, update, and delete CRUD operations, use the least amount of storage space, and are not for historical data in a Snowflake schema. Which type of database can be used for semi-structured data that will be processed by an Apache Spark pool in Azure Synapse Analytics? Which type of database can be used for semi-structured data that will be processed by an Apache Spark pool in Azure Synapse Analytics? Column family databases are used to store unstructured, tabular data comprising rows and columns. Azure Synapse Analytics Spark pools do not directly support graph or relational databases. Which two types of file store data in columnar format? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Awk and Parquet are columnar data formats. Avro is row-based, and CSV is used for delimited data. Which two attributes are characteristics of an analytical data workload? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Analytical data workloads are highly denormalized and are optimized for read operations. Which type of data workload is optimized for updates and relies on relationships between entities to correlate data? Which type of data workload is optimized for updates and relies on relationships between entities to correlate data? Transactional workloads are optimized for create, read, update, and delete CRUD operations. Analytical databases are highly denormalized to store large amounts of aggregated data and are optimized for reads. Time series workloads do not store large amounts of aggregated data. Graph workloads store hierarchical data. Which feature of transactional data processing guarantees that concurrent processes cannot see the data in an inconsistent state? Which feature of transactional data processing guarantees that concurrent processes cannot see the data in an inconsistent state? Isolation in transactional data processing ensures that concurrent transactions cannot interfere with one another and must result in a consistent database state. Which two types of applications are used in transactional systems? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Live applications are used in transactional data processing systems. Lob applications are a type of live application that processes business data. Which job role is responsible for designing database solutions, creating databases, and developing stored procedures? Which two keys are needed to create a one-to-many relationship between two tables in a relational database? Each correct answer presents part of the solution. A primary key and a foreign key are needed for a one-to-many relationship. You need a primary key that must be unique, but is not just a unique key. Index keys are used for searches. In a relational database, on which type of objects should you configure a data type? Data types are applied to columns to enforce the type of data that can be stored. For example, you can apply an integer data type to a column that must contain only whole numbers, such as a column for quantity. What are two advantages of using normalization over not using normalization in a relational database? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Normalization uses the least possible amount of storage. Normalization optimizes for updates, inserts, and deletes. Normalization does not optimize for complex reads and does not provide a mechanism for unstructured data. Which three statements accurately describe the properties of a table in a relational database? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Each row in a table in a relational database has the same number of columns, can have a primary key built on multiple columns, and must have a data type. Tables in relational databases do not need all the columns to contain values or require that there be only one foreign key. You need to recommend a solution that meets the following requirements: encapsulates a business logic that can rename the products in a database, adds entries to tables. What should you include in the recommendation? A stored procedure can encapsulate any type of business logic that can be reused in the application. A stored procedure can modify existing data as well as add new entries to tables. A stored procedure can be run from an application as well as from the server. An inline function cannot be used to complete the task because it cannot modify nor create objects. It can be used to query a database. A view cannot be used to complete the task because it cannot modify nor create objects. It can be used to query a database. A table valued function cannot be used to complete the task because it cannot modify or create objects. It can be used to query a database. In a relational database, what can you use to create a virtual table from the results of a select statement? A view is a virtual table based on the results of a select query. A stored procedure defines SQL statements that can be run on command. An index helps you search for data in a table. A relationship is an association between two tables. Which three open source databases are available as platform as a service, PaaS, in Azure? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Azure Database for MariaDB is a PaaS service. Azure Database for MySQL is a PaaS service. Azure Database for PostgreSQL is a PaaS service. You can use CockroachDB and CouchDB on a virtual machine. Which data service allows you to use every feature of Microsoft SQL Server in the cloud? SQL Server on an Azure virtual machines running Windows is the only option that supports all the SQL Server features in the cloud. Azure SQL Database, SQL Managed Instance, and SQL Server on an Azure virtual machines running Linux do not support all the SQL Server features. Which data service allows you to create a single database that can scale up and down without downtime? Which data service allows you to create a single database that can scale up and down without downtime? Azure SQL Database allows you to provision a single database on a dedicated server and has on-demand scalability. SQL Managed Instance can support multiple databases, and SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machines is installed on a virtual machine, where each instance can support multiple databases. Which data service allows you to migrate an entire Microsoft SQL Server to the cloud without requiring that you manage the infrastructure after the migration? SQL Managed Instance allows you to migrate an entire SQL Server to the cloud without requiring that you manage the infrastructure after the migration. You must manage all aspects of SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machines. Azure SQL Database supports most, but not all, core database level capabilities of SQL Server. Which data service allows you to control the amount of RAM, change the I/O subsystem configuration, and add or remove CPUs? SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machines allows you the control to manage the system. Azure SQL Database and SQL Managed Instance are fully automated in terms of updates, backups, and recovery. Which open source database has built-in support for temporal data? MariaDB has built-in support for temporal data. It enables applications to query data as the data appeared in previous points in time. Which type of Azure storage is the least expensive option that allows you to store and edit image files? Block blobs are used for files and the archive tier is the least expensive option. The cool tier is not the least expensive option. Append blobs cannot be updated. Which type of Azure storage is used to store large amounts of files to be shared with virtual machines by using SMB? Azure Files is used to share files by using NFS and SMB. Data Lake Storage Gen 2 is used for storing huge amounts of data to be processed, not to be shared among virtual machines. Page blobs are used for VHDs. Table storage is used for two-dimensional tables. Which Azure Blob Storage access tier should you use for data that will be used once per year and can have an access time that takes more than an hour? Which two storage solutions can be mounted in Azure Synapse Analytics and used to process large volumes of data? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Blob storage and data lake storage can be used to store massive amounts of data and can be mounted in Azure Synapse Analytics. Azure Files and table storage cannot be mounted in Azure Synapse Analytics. What are two characteristics of Azure Table Storage? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Row key is unique within a partition, not within a table. Items in the same partitions are stored in a row key order. Tables cannot have indexes to speed up queries. Which type of blob should you use to store data blocks that are added to a file frequently but cannot be deleted? Which type of blob should you use to store data blocks that are added to a file frequently but cannot be deleted? Which Azure Cosmos DB API should you use for data in a column family storage structure? The Cassandra API is used for tabular data in a column family storage. The Gremlin API is used for graph databases. MongoDB API stores data in the binary JSON format. Table is used to retrieve key-value pairs. Which Azure Cosmos DB API should you use for data in key/value tables? Which Azure Cosmos DB API should you use for data in key/value tables? Which storage solution allows you to aggregate data stored in JSON files for use in analytical reports without additional development effort? Which Azure Cosmos DB API allows you to work with vertices and edges? What should you use to create and run data ingestion pipelines? What should you use to create and run data ingestion pipelines? Data Factory is used to run ETL pipelines. Databricks is used for processing large amounts of data, which is supported by multiple cloud providers. HD Insight is used to process large amounts of data. Which native Azure service can you use to process data by running Apache Spark jobs? Which native Azure service can you use to process data by running Apache Spark jobs? Which type of data store uses star schemas, fact tables, and dimension tables? Data warehouses use fact and dimension tables in a star/Snowflake schema. Relational databases do not use fact and dimension tables. Cubes are generated from a data warehouse but are a table themselves. Data lakes store files. Which two services allow you to create a pipeline to process data in response to an event? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Which two services allow you to create a pipeline to process data in response to an event? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Azure Synapse Analytics and Data Factory both allow you to create a pipeline in response to an event. Databricks and HD Insight run data processing tasks. What is a characteristic of batch processing? Batch processing is used to execute complex analysis. Batch processing handles a large amount of data at a time. Batch processing is usually measured in minutes and hours. You are processing data by using batches and streams. What should you use to ensure that transactional consistency is enforced during the processing? Delta Lake is an open-source storage layer that adds support to data lake storage for transactional consistency. Which service allows you to aggregate data over a specific time window before the data is written to a data lake? Which service allows you to aggregate data over a specific time window before the data is written to a data lake? Stream analytics allows you to aggregate data from a specific period before it is written to a data lake. Event Hubs is used as a source or a sink for stream processing. Azure SQL database is used to persist processed results in a database table for querying and analysis. Which type of visual in Microsoft Power BI should you use to identify the correlation between two numeric measures? Scatter plots are used to determine a relationship or correlation between two numeric values. Pie charts visually compare different values as a proportion of a total. Line charts are used to examine trends, usually over time. Bar charts are used to compare different values for discrete categories. What should you create in a data model to allow users to drill up and drill down in a report? A hierarchy enables drill up and drill down in a dimension. A dimension enables navigation, but hierarchy is used to drill up and down in a dimension. Fact tables have values. Cubes are not created in Microsoft Power BI. Which data model element represents the entities by which you want to aggregate measures in Microsoft Power BI? Dimensions are used to aggregate data. Fact tables contain measures that are aggregated, not values to aggregate by. A relationship is used to tie facts to dimensions. Keys are used to establish relationships. Which two visuals in Microsoft Power BI allow you to visually compare numeric values for discrete categories? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Bar charts and column charts allow you to compare numeric values for discrete values. A card is used to track a single number or value. A matrix makes it easier to view data across multiple dimensions. Which visual in Microsoft Power BI allows you to view trends, such as changes in sales over time? Line charts are used to compare categorized values, often to show trends over time. Pie charts are used to show categories as a proportion of a total. Tables are used to display multiple related values. In the Power BI service, what should you create to share a single page with the most important visuals from reports? You need to share a report that you created in Microsoft Power BI Desktop with other users. What should you do first? Select the answer that correctly completes the sentence. Answer choice is the logical container used to combine and organize Azure resources. Resources are combined into resource groups, which act as a logical container into which Azure resources like web apps, databases, and storage accounts are deployed and managed. Select the answer that correctly completes the sentence. Answer choice are physically separate data centers within an Azure region. Select the answer that correctly completes the sentence. In a region pair, a region is paired with another region in the same answer choice. Which two components are created in an Azure subscription? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Resources can only be associated with a single subscription. Subscriptions may be grouped into management groups. An account may be associated with multiple subscriptions. Which resource can you use to manage access, policies, and compliance across multiple subscriptions? Which Azure Compute service can you use to deploy and manage a set of identical virtual machines? You need to allow resources on two different Azure virtual networks to communicate with each other. What should you configure? You can link virtual networks together by using virtual network peering. Peering enables resources in each virtual network to communicate with each other. What can you use to connect Azure resources, such as Azure SQL databases, to an Azure virtual network? What can you use to connect Azure resources, such as Azure SQL databases, to an Azure virtual network? Service endpoints are used to expose Azure services to a virtual network, providing communication between the two. ExpressRoute is used to connect an on-premises network to Azure. NSGs allow you to configure inbound and outbound rules for virtual networks and virtual machines. Peering allows you to connect virtual networks together. Which Azure Blob storage tier stores data offline and offers the lowest storage costs and the highest costs to access data? Which storage service offers fully managed file shares in the cloud that are accessible by using Server Message Block (SMB) protocol? Which two scenarios are common use cases for Azure Blob storage? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Low storage costs and unlimited file formats make blob storage a good location to store backups and archives. Blob storage can be reached from anywhere by using an internet connection. Azure Disk Storage provides disks for Azure virtual machines. Azure Files supports mounting file storage shares. What enables a user to sign in one time and use that credential to access multiple resources and applications from different providers? What can you use to ensure that a user can only access applications from compliant devices? What can you use to allow a user to manage all the resources in a resource group? Which type of strategy uses a series of mechanisms to slow the advancement of an attack that aims to gain unauthorized access to data? Which two services are provided by Azure AD? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. What Azure AD feature can you use to ensure that users can only access Microsoft Office 365 applications from approved client applications? What can you use to ensure that users authenticate by using multi-factor authentication, MFA, when they attempt to sign in from a specific location? Which two scenarios are common billing use cases for resource tags? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Which two scenarios are common billing use cases for resource tags? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. You can use tags to categorize costs by department, such as human resources, marketing, or finance, or by environment, such as test or production. Resizing underutilized virtual machines is a good cost-saving measure, and provisioning resources in lower-cost regions is a good practice, but resource tags do not help with this. You plan to build a new solution in Azure that will use Platform as a Service, PaaS, products. What should you use to estimate the monthly costs? The Azure Pricing Calculator allows you to estimate and configure according to your specific requirements. You will then receive a consolidated estimated price and a detailed breakdown of the costs associated with each resource you added to your solution. Which two features are available by using Azure Cost Management and Billing? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. You have an Azure virtual machine that is accessed only between 9 and 17 o'clock each day. What should you do to minimize costs but preserve the associated hard disks and data? If you have virtual machine workloads that are used only during certain periods, but you run them every hour of every day, then you are wasting money. These virtual machines are great candidates to delocate when not in use and start back when required to save compute costs while the virtual machines are delocated. You need to associate the costs of resources to different groups within an organization without changing the location of the resources. What should you use? What allows you to orchestrate the deployment of resource templates, Azure policy assignments, and resource groups? What allows you to orchestrate the deployment of resource templates, Azure policy assignments, and resource groups? What allows you to orchestrate the deployment of resource templates, Azure policy assignments, and resource groups? What can you use to restrict the deployment of a virtual machine to a specific location? What can you use to ensure that a development team can only create virtual machines of a certain size? What should you use to access Azure Cloud Shell? What can you use to create resources in Azure and includes a validation step to ensure all resources are created in a specific order based on dependencies, in parallel and idempotent? Which two tools can you use to create a new Azure virtual machine from a mobile device that runs Android? Each correct answer presents complete solution. The Azure portal can run on devices that have the Android operating system installed. The browser can be any type, such as Internet Explorer 11, Chrome, Firefox, or Safari, all the latest versions. When you visit the portal, you will see Cloud Shell. Users can then access Bash and PowerShell from within Cloud Shell. You can use Bash and PowerShell to create Azure virtual machines. Which Azure service evaluates Azure resources and makes recommendations to help improve reliability, security, performance, and cost reduction? Azure Advisor evaluates Azure resources and makes recommendations to help improve reliability, security, and performance. You need to be notified when there are new recommendations for reducing Azure costs. Which tool should you use? You need to create a custom solution that uses thresholds to trigger auto-scaling functionality to scale an app up or down to meet user demand. What should you include in the solution? Azure Monitor is a platform that collects metric and logging data, such as CPU percentages. The data can be used to trigger auto-scaling. What should you proactively review and act on to avoid service interruptions, such as service retirements and breaking changes? What can you use to automatically detect performance anomalies for web apps? What can you use to get notification about an outage in a specific Azure region? Which two attributes are characteristics of the private cloud deployment model? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Which two attributes are characteristics of the private cloud deployment model? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. What are two characteristics of the public cloud deployment model? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Which two characteristics are common advantages of cloud computing? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Which cloud deployment model are you using if you have servers physically located at your organization's on-site data center, and you migrate a few of the servers to the cloud? An example of answer choice is automatically scaling an application to ensure that the application has the resources needed to meet customer demands. Increasing the capacity of an application by adding additional virtual machine is called answer choice. In which two deployment models are customers responsible for managing operating systems that host applications? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. In which two deployment models are customers responsible for managing operating systems that host applications? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Operating systems are managed by customers when using IaaS or an on-premises deployments. The operating systems are not accessible in PaaS and SaaS deployments. Which cloud service model provides you with the most control over the hardware that runs applications? In a platform as a service, PaaS, model, which two components are the responsibility of the cloud service provider? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Which type of cloud service model is typically licensed through a monthly or annual subscription? In which cloud service model is the customer responsible for managing the operating system? Your organization is building a custom application. You need to focus on application development rather than configuration and management of servers. Which cloud service model should you use? IaaS helps you reduce the cost and complexity of maintaining a physical server and its data center infrastructure. Virtual networks are part of the IaaS cloud service. Which two attributes are characteristics of the private cloud deployment model? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Why is cloud computing often less expensive than on-premises data centers? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Answer choice refers to upfront costs incurred one time, such as hardware purchases. Which cloud deployment model are you using if you have servers physically located at your organization's on-site data center, and you migrate a few of the servers to the cloud? Increasing compute capacity for an app by adding RAM or CPUs to a virtual machine is called answer choice. Deploying and configuring cloud-based resources quickly as business requirements change is called answer choice. Deploying and configuring cloud-based resources quickly as business requirements change is called answer choice. Agility means that you can deploy and configure cloud-based resources quickly as app requirements change. Scalability means that you can add RAM, CPU, or entire virtual machines to a configuration. Elasticity means that you can configure cloud-based apps to take advantage of auto-scaling, so apps always have the resources they need. High availability means that cloud-based apps can provide a continuous user experience with no apparent downtime, even when things go wrong. Agility means that you can deploy and configure cloud-based resources quickly as app requirements change. Scalability means that you can add RAM, CPU, or entire virtual machines to a configuration. Elasticity means that you can configure cloud-based apps to take advantage of auto-scaling, so apps always have the resources they need. High availability means that cloud-based apps can provide a continuous user experience with no apparent downtime, even when things go wrong. What are cloud-based backup services, data replication, and geo-distribution features of? What is high availability in a public cloud environment dependent on? Which cloud service model provides you with the most control over the hardware that runs applications? In which cloud service model is the customer responsible for managing the operating system? Your organization is building a custom application. You need to focus on application development rather than configuration and management of servers. Which cloud service model should you use? What uses the infrastructure as a service, IaaS, cloud service model? Answer choice are physically separate data centers within an Azure region. In a region pair, a region is paired with another region in the same answer choice. Which two components are created in an Azure subscription? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. What is an Azure storage account named Storage 001 an example of? A resource is a manageable item that is available through Azure. Virtual machines, storage accounts, web apps, databases, and virtual networks are examples of resources. For which resource does Azure generate separate billing reports and invoices by default? Which Azure component allows you to replicate resources across a geography to ensure business continuity during a natural disaster at the primary site? Answer choice is the deployment and management service for Azure. Which Azure resource is a software emulation of a physical computer that includes a virtual processor, memory, storage, and networking resources? Which Azure resource is a software emulation of a physical computer that includes a virtual processor, memory, storage, and networking resources? Which Azure Compute service can you use to deploy and manage a set of identical virtual machines? Which two services can you use to establish network connectivity between an on-premises network and Azure resources? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. What can you use to provide Mac and Android users with access to a Windows environment that will run Windows-based applications? What can you use to provide Mac and Android users with access to a Windows environment that will run Windows-based applications? Which storage service should you use to store thousands of files containing text and images? Which Azure Blob storage tier stores data offline and offers the lowest storage costs and the highest costs to access data? Which Azure storage service should you use to store unstructured files, such as images, that will be served on web pages? Which two protocols are used to access Azure file shares? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. What enables a user to sign in one time and use that credential to access multiple resources and applications from different providers? Which type of strategy uses a series of mechanisms to slow the advancement of an attack that aims to gain unauthorized access to data? Which two services are provided by Azure AD? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Azure AD provides services for verifying identity and access to applications and resources. SSO enables you to remember a single username and password to access multiple applications and is available in Azure AD. What can you use to ensure that users authenticate by using multi-factor authentication, MFA, when they attempt to sign in from a specific location? You plan to build a new solution in Azure that will use Platform as a Service, PaaS, products. What should you use to estimate the monthly costs? The Azure Pricing Calculator allows you to estimate and configure according to your specific requirements. You will then receive a consolidated estimated price and a detailed breakdown of the costs associated with each resource you added to your solution. You need to associate the costs of resources to different groups within an organization without changing the location of the resources. What should you use? What can you use to ensure that new and existing Azure resources stay in compliance with corporate standards? You need to ensure that multi-factor authentication, MFA, is enabled on accounts with right permissions in an Azure subscription. What should you implement? What allows you to orchestrate the deployment of resource templates, Azure policy assignments, and resource groups? What allows you to orchestrate the deployment of resource templates, Azure policy assignments, and resource groups? What can you use to restrict the deployment of a virtual machine to a specific location? What can you use to restrict the deployment of a virtual machine to a specific location? Which two tools are accessible via Azure Cloud Shell and allows you to write bash scripts to manage an Azure environment? What can you use to create resources in Azure and includes a validation step to ensure all resources are created in a specific order based on dependencies, in parallel and idempotent? Which two tools can you use to create a new Azure virtual machine from a mobile device that runs Android? Each correct answer presents complete solution. What provides recommendations to reduce the cost of Azure resources? Which Azure service evaluates Azure resources and makes recommendations to help improve reliability, security, performance, and cost reduction? You need to review the root cause analysis, RCA, report for a service outage that occurred last week. Where should you look for the report? After an outage, Service Health provides official incident reports called Root Cause Analysis, RCA, which you can share with stakeholders. You need to be notified when there are new recommendations for reducing Azure costs. Which tool should you use? You need to create a custom solution that uses thresholds to trigger auto-scaling functionality to scale an app up or down to meet user demand. What should you include in the solution? You need to create a custom solution that uses thresholds to trigger auto-scaling functionality to scale an app up or down to meet user demand. What should you include in the solution? What can you use to automatically detect performance anomalies for web apps? What can you use to find information about planned maintenance for Azure services that are critical to your organization? You can drill down to the affected services, regions, and details to show how an event will affect you and what you must do. Most of these events occur without any impact to you and will not be shown. In a rare case that a reboot is required, Service Health allows you to choose when to perform the maintenance to minimize the downtime.
I want an extra check. I want to say, look, you can't change this or you can't delete it. Or at least you have to go and perform an extra step so you don't accidentally do something. So what we can actually do is we can create these things called resource locks. And I can then apply that at different levels. So again, I could think about, hey, look, I could apply it at the subscription. It will get inherited down. I might apply it at a certain resource group. I might apply it at a certain resource. And what I can do with the resource lock is I can do one of two things. Can not delete. So I can change it, but I can't delete it. Or I can say I don't even want you to change it. I can say read only, so you cannot change or delete it. So I can go and create the resource lock. And then what it would do is, if I accidentally went and tried to change or delete it, depending on which lock I set, it wouldn't let me. It would say, hey, you can't do this. I would have to then go and remove the lock. So I'd have to be the owner, basically, to be able to do that. And then once I've removed the lock, then I could go and modify, delete, or just delete, depending on which one I set. And it does get inherited. So if I set a resource lock at the subscription level, whatever that effect was, would apply to everything within there as well. So that's something I can go and do. Another really useful thing is we talked about JSON was kind of the metadata. So these aren't JSON templates that are fundamentally talking JSON. Well, there's optional metadata we can set. Because I might want to be able to identify who's the owner, what's the business unit, what's the purpose, what's the criticality. So if I want metadata, one of the things we can add is something called tags. And again, this is basically metadata. It is a key and a value. And just like pretty much everything else, I can set this at I can set it at the description, I can set it at the resource group, I can set it at the individual resource. Now, important thing, most things we've talked about get inherited. RBAC, policy, budget rolls up, resource locks get inherited. Tags do not inherit. If I create a tag at the resource group, the resources within it will not have that tag. So just keep that in mind. If I wanted the resources to copy the tag from the resource group, I can do that with policy. I can create policy that says, hey, look, if you're missing this tag, go and copy the value from the resource log. But by default, you do not inherit tags. And again, they're just metadata. I'll use them for different things. If I go and look at, for example, my virtual machine here, I configured a couple of tags. And I had, for example, over here where I did one for the cost center, I did one for environment, I did one for the operating system, one for the owner. You might see other ones for the type of resource. You might see an exact billing ID. It could be security, like public or confidential. It could have different regulatory tags. It's whatever you want. This is not a fixed schema. I can go ahead and add any value I want. And show me ones that I've done already. I can go and create a completely new one. I could go and create any value I wanted. If I wanted to control, what do you think I would do? I could use policy. So I could use policy to restrict what I could actually do here. And these tags are really useful. I can search and find things with a certain tag value. When I do billing, I could actually say, hey, show me the bill, and I want to filter it by tags that have this certain value. So tagging that metadata is super, super useful for that. Another key construct we have is, well, I talked about a bunch of different things so far. I talked about RBAC and resource group and policy and templates. What about if I've got kind of a new subscription and I want to be able to apply maybe a base configuration? I want to be able to stamp down a certain configuration. Well, we can do that. We have a construct called a blueprint. And a blueprint basically enables me to contain a number of different types of artifacts. So I can define resource groups. Then within that resource group, I can apply an ARM template, which again, remember, creates resources. I can apply role-based access control. I can apply policy. And I could create a resource group too, etc. So these 4 types of resources I can define in my blueprint. And then I basically assign it to a subscription, where it will then go and create all those things. Now, when I do that assignment, I actually have different options for how it's going to actually assign. If we go and look, let's jump over to my subscription. I have a blueprint. And it's a super simple one. All I basically do in this blueprint is, you can see here, at the subscription level, I apply a policy that sets a tag. Then I create a resource group called RG Networking. I set role-based access control to give the network admins group the contributor right. Then I deploy an ARM template that creates a core virtual network. But again, I can do lots of other things. So I define the list of artifacts I want, and then I assign it. And when I do the assignment, I get to pick a lock assignment. So do not lock, I don't lock, says, well, put this there, but then they can change, delete, whatever they want to do. Do not delete says, well, they can change it, but they can't delete the things I create. Read only, as you would guess, you can't change or delete them. And it does maintain the connection between the blueprint and where I've assigned it. So if I want to create a new version of the blueprint with changes, I can then update that assignment. A really important thing is with these assignments, both blueprints and resource locks, they're applying at the Azure Resource Manager level, which is kind of the control plane. There's 2 planes in Azure. There's the control plane, what Azure Resource Manager does, create resources, delete resources, modify resources. And there's the resource itself has a data plane, create a row in a table, create a file in a storage account. All of these things apply at the Azure Resource Manager control plane. They do not apply to things at the data plane. So even if a storage account, for example, was locked or had this do not read only, I can still create blobs and delete blobs. It's not impacting the data plane. It only impacts the control plane, i.e. the resources that the Azure Resource Manager controls. Because when I do data plane actions, they're not going through the Azure Resource Manager. So all of these things apply only to that control plane. One other thing when I think about creating this, it can seem intimidating. There's a lot of different things happening here. So when I'm trying to think, okay, well, how do I get started? What is the right thing to do? There's something called the Cloud Adoption Framework. So Cloud Adoption Framework is really this set of guidance. And it's all structured around the idea, well, I want to lay out a strategy. I need to make a plan about what I'm going to do. I'm going to get my organization ready. Then I'm going to adopt the cloud, migrate resources, and then kind of govern, manage the environments. There's all these detailed steps for every single part of this. So really my recommendation here would be to walk through this. Again, the handout for this course has all of these links in it. I'm not putting it in this video. Go and get the handout for the course. For that, it's good to have a basic understanding of exactly what this is and what it's doing as part of your prepreparation. So understand, hey, Cloud Adoption Framework, it's all about things to help me get started and really just get the right ideas so I start off as best practice as possible. Okay, so talked about a lot. We've not really talked about types of resource yet. And there's a lot of different types of resource. So what I want to do now is just give some base understanding of the types of resource and when we would really kind of use them. So let's maybe jump over here. We'll go above this. So the first type of resource we're typically going to use is going to be a virtual machine, a VM. Now if you think about a virtual machine, think about a regular machine. I have maybe a certain number of cores or virtual CPUs. I have a certain amount of memory. Maybe I have certain amounts of storage, IOPS and throughput. I have certain network connectivity. But I have certain characteristics. And that's exactly what a virtual machine is. A VM is just a collection of resources that we're making available to this certain unit of work. Now, a key point is, when I create a VM on premises, sometimes I want that VM to have lots of memory. Maybe it's a database. Sometimes I want it to have lots of CPU, it's just doing some processing. Maybe I want a balanced mix. So it's exactly the same thing in the cloud. In the cloud, we have different SKUs. And a big focus of these SKUs is about things like, well, virtual CPU to memory ratios. But also there might be special characteristics. So if we go and look at all the different SKUs that are available, if we go and look at the virtual machine sizes, what we'll see is we could start with the idea of we have these compute optimized. And if I was to look at compute optimized, what we'll see is there's a whole number of different sizes. But you'll see all of the different properties scale the same way. So CPUs, memory, temp storage, max data, cached, all of these values increase proportionally. And what we're focusing on here is this ratio. So for every 2 CPUs, we get 4 gigabytes of memory. So it's a 1-to-2 ratio. If I was to look at general purpose, there's a whole bunch of these, again, different generations of processor, different temporary storage, different ability to do other types of things. Well, now my ratio is 2-to-8, so it's 1-to-4. So there's a bit more memory for each virtual CPU. This is general purpose. Then there's memory optimized. And exactly as you guess, this time, it's 2-to-16 or 1-to-8. But also there's going to be differences in the amount of IOPS I get. I have ones with GPUs. I have ones that have FPGAs. I have ones that have RDMA network adapters. And then within those, they have those different sizes. So there's whole sets of different types of virtual machines based on exactly what I need it to do. So I pick the right SKU, and then once I pick the SKU, well, I pick a certain size based on the amount of work it actually needs to do. Now, I have full flexibility within that. Remember, responsibility, I'm responsible for everything inside there. I can pick the OS, Windows or Linux. I can pick the antivirus and the firewall. You're not on your own. There are a whole bunch of extensions in Azure to help you with these things. But fundamentally, you get to pick what you want to do. So it's like the most basic building block, virtual machine. But often we have multiple virtual machines. I have many of them for scale purposes, for resiliency purposes. So the next type of thing we might build on top of that is something called a virtual machine scale set. Now what this enables me to do is pick kind of a certain template for the disk, pick a certain configuration, but also pick a certain scale. So I can have a minimum number, a maximum number, and even auto scale. If you think consumption basis, I want to change the number of things I have based on the workload, this lets me do that with this auto scale capability. And this is going to go and create VMs. So I create this virtual machine scale set that then behind the scenes will create the virtual machines. It will create them, delete them based on maybe a schedule, maybe on some trigger. The average CPU is above 70%, go and add some more. Average CPU is below 30%, well, let's delete a couple. So it's going to go and create those virtual machines for me. Now, many other things are going to build on top of like virtual machines and virtual machine scale sets. But realize, again, the cloud is someone else's PC. So there are servers. So most of the time, there's going to be these big racks of servers, and essentially there's a host. And when I create this thing, hey, look, my VM gets created on a certain host. But someone else's VM from another tenant will get created on that host as well. And someone from another tenant gets created on that host as well. There's full isolation by the hypervisor, by the software-defined networking, through the encryption. That's not a concern for most people. However, there may be scenarios where I do not want to be on a host with another customer. Now, by definition, the public cloud is multi-tenant, but I want to just have my stuff on a certain box. So what I can do is there's something called Azure Dedicated Host. And what that lets me do is I can buy out the entire box. So I'm basically paying for the entire capacity. And then I can fill it up with VMs. Now, Azure Dedicated Host, just like the different SKUs of virtual machines that have different ratios, the hosts are the same. So I buy a host of a particular SKU, and then I can fill it with VMs of that SKU type. Now I can have different sizes, so I can have maybe some little ones or some really big ones, but they're all going to be of the same SKU of the host. If we go and look for a second, we look at Azure Dedicated Host pricing, what we see is we buy the host of a certain type. And then that's showing us the type of VM that I can actually run on that host. So I'm basically buying out, I pay for the host, and I can run as many VMs as I can cram in of the same type of the host. Now there is another option. Now obviously I can create lots of those. So I can create multiple Azure Dedicated Hosts. I could put them maybe in different fault domains or different racks, so I can get resiliency from that type of thing. But also, some VMs are just really big. So sometimes you'll create a VM that actually just takes up the entire box. So there are these isolated VMs. So I'm not creating an Azure Dedicated Host, I'm not creating a box just for me, but just by virtue of the VM is so big, there are these isolated VMs. So if I create one of those, and these are listed as well, then I'm going to be on my own box because, well, no one else can fit on the box. I'm taking up the whole box. So realize that's another way I can kind of get that isolation as well. So either I'm buying out the whole box, or I'm just creating a VM that's so big, no one else can fit on it. So I have VMs, so I have virtual machine scale sets. Typically we deploy to a multi-tenant set of hosts, but I can do dedicated, or I just create really big. There's also Azure Batch. So Azure Batch is all about the idea of these really large-scale workloads. I have this job that I want to run. It's a large-scale parallel workload. It's the high-performance computing. And Azure Batch will go and spin up the resources I need, the VMs, to execute that job. It will queue it up and run it as required. So if I have that large-scale execution, Azure Batch is great for that. Now, all of these are based around virtual machines. And virtual machines are based around the idea that we're virtualizing the hardware. We create a virtual machine that's a portion carved out of CPU and memory and storage and networking. Where a lot of things are moving to is the idea of containers. And if a virtual machine virtualizes the hardware, a container is more about virtualizing the software. So I could think about, well, there's a container host, which could be a VM. And that container host is running a certain operating system. So that's kind of at the kernel. Then there's a container runtime, and that basically creates these little sandboxes. So these isolated environments in the user mode space. So it's the same operating system, but it's creating these isolated sandboxes. And then what we have with containers is the idea that we have a registry where we have images. So we have a whole bunch of different images, and we essentially take the image and we run it in a container instance. And that image itself is really multiple layers. There's like a base OS layer, then a runtime layer, then an app layer, maybe some customization, and that then runs. But the benefit of containers, if I think about a VM takes time to start. I have to create the VM, stand up the operating system, and it's fairly heavy. The operating system has memory requirements and storage requirements. Well, if containers are sharing a container host is there already. So when I create a new container, it spins up near instantly, and it's very, very low overhead because it's sharing that container runtime. Now, it is sharing a container runtime. It's sharing a host, which means typically I want to trust my neighbor. And so that's great if me as a customer, I have multiple containers, I can run on the same host. But if I'm multi-tenant, I don't trust the person over there. And so there are sometimes different services that will essentially create a managed VM automatically and just run your container image with you on your own. There's a whole bunch standby so it can spin up really, really quickly. But containers have these nice isolated. They have controlled amount of resource they can use. I have isolated namespaces so they can't see each other's processes, isolated networking, they can't see each other's networking. It's got that great isolation. Okay, so I want to use containers. I'm in Azure. What can I do? Well, if I just want to run a couple of containers, there are Azure container instances. And this really is this idea. Hey, I have an image. I want to be able to just run it. I can create a container instance to just run that. If I have multiple ones that want to be able to work together, I can actually create a container group. And with a container group, they will essentially inhabit that same container host. But otherwise, if I create an Azure container instance, it runs on its own host. I'm not going to run it with some other customer because I don't want to share a kernel with some other customer. There's things they maybe can do. So Azure container instances will isolate automatically to give me that protection. So Azure container instance, I can have a public-facing endpoint. Or I can integrate with a virtual network as well. So I have that choice. So virtual network is a private network for my resources. I have different sizes that I can create, but it's a fairly basic thing. What about if I want a richer set of capabilities? I want to be able to auto-scale these out. I want rich networking integration. I want full orchestration. I want balancing. I want policy. Well, the standard in kind of that richer container environment is something called Kubernetes. And I could stand up Kubernetes myself. I could absolutely create a bunch of VMs and stand up Kubernetes. But why do that? So what we have in Azure is we have the Azure Kubernetes service. Now I'm going to draw it as a cloud because there's two parts to Kubernetes. The first thing is there's basically a management plane. So there's this management plane, the control plane for Kubernetes. With AKS, this is fully managed for me. Behind the scenes, there's a whole kind of set. There's a scheduler, there's an API server, there's an etcd database kind of hidden in here. There's a bunch of other things. They're all managed for me. I do not see those things. That's provided as a service. What I see in my environment are the nodes. So I create node pools, which are of a certain type. Behind the scenes, what do you think this is using? Yep, it's using virtual machine scale sets. So these things will kind of build on each other. And this is where my containers run. So with AKS, the management plane is just there for me. It's maintained for me. I then push deployment YAML files, it's declarative, or there's IDOPS where I can pull it from a repo, and then it will go and schedule my containers. Now, my containers run in things called pods in the Kubernetes world. But I have great networking capabilities. I can integrate with virtual networks. I can have persistent storage through Azure files or disks or many, many other types of things. I can have different node pools of different types. Maybe some of them are GPUs, some of them are just regular VMs, some of them might be memory-centric, but I have all of these flexibility and choice in how I'm going to create these various node pools for the types of resources I actually want. So if you hear, hey, I want to use containers in Azure, I want to run Kubernetes, or I want some rich orchestration, what service should I use? It's probably going to be AKS. Now, as we carry on thinking about PaaS, then there's Azure App Service. Now, App Services actually can run containers as well, but typically we think of app services when it's some kind of web-focused workload. Now, in terms of web-focused workload, that could be a web app. That could be an API service. Maybe it's going to integrate things like Swagger. It's going to host that for me. Maybe it's a mobile kind of application I'm trying to write, in which case it gives me these nice kind of push notification capabilities. But I have these different types of service. And again, I just focus on the code. I create an instance of a web app. I select the runtime. I can be Windows or Linux. And here's my code. I don't worry about anything else. Depending on the SKU, it might have things like auto scale there for me as well. I just don't have to worry about that stuff. So we like these app services. If I was, hey, you want to create a new web application, I want to minimize any maintenance overhead. I'm using maybe it's .NET or it could be Java. There's a whole set of different things. App service is probably a great solution for that. Now, so far, all of these, although these are PaaS, underneath, there are VMs. And what I pay for is really a number of SKU sizes of VM. I don't manage them, but they're there. That's what I'm paying for. What we then move into are the serverless offerings. And the whole point of serverless is I don't pay for some unit of virtual machine. I pay for the work it actually does. So that's kind of a real key point of this. Another key point of serverless is they are event-driven. Because they're not typically just running all the time. Something has to happen. That could be a blob is written to a storage account, a message is written to a queue, someone calls a RESTful API, there's a schedule, a timer, but something has to trigger this to actually happen. And then there's different, well, what am I doing? There's different serverless offerings. But the whole point is I pay for work done. And there's two offerings. So the first is Azure Functions. Azure Functions is really all about running some code I've written. It supports many different languages, but I'm writing the code and then it's going to run it for me. It's designed to be short-lived. It doesn't have kind of state between executions. There is a way to do that with durable functions, but typically they're not. They're there to do some little piece of work, and it goes away. So it spins up, it comes alive to do something, then it disappears. I pay for the work it does. Now, I can actually run Azure Functions as part of an app service plan, or I can run it in consumption-only mode. But Azure Function is, I have some code, I want to run it in a serverless way. Hey, Azure Function is great for that. The other one is Azure Logic Apps. And I can really think about this as no or low code. This is all about this graphical kind of canvas idea that I can drag these connectors. There's these pre-built collection of connectors that are wrappers to some API out there. There's about 200 of them. And I can just drag it onto this designer. So if we go and look really quickly, if I was to look at functions for a second, if I look at a function app, I can create a function app. But the key point of a function app is fundamentally, it's code. Now mine here, I think it's PowerShell based on this particular one, but it's just some code. So I still have the code. I have to understand those constructs to be able to use that. But I wrote the code to do this piece of work. But it's going to run it based on some trigger. Whereas if I look at a logic app, with a logic app, let's just look at this one. If I look at the designer, I'm not coding. Or maybe occasionally I write a little single line of something to do something pretty easy, but for the most part, I am not coding. What I'm instead doing is I get this great visual designer, if it decides to actually open up, and I can just drag and drop different components from these connectors to perform certain actions. Try and refresh this. Come on, wake up. But you'll just see basically a bunch of boxes. I can drag and drop from connectors. So I'm not writing code. And there's a whole bunch of templates built in that I can leverage to actually do this. Okay, maybe we'll come back to this later on. But the whole point is a visual designer. I'm not writing code. There's a whole bunch of connectors out there, and I'll just see boxes. Hey, do this thing. Maybe, hey, look, a tweet is received. We'll go and call cognitive services to go and get sentiment. Okay, now go and write something to a queue. It's just dragging these different things from connectors that will, hey, make all that work. So I don't have to understand coding. It's the idea of a citizen developer. Anyone can really go and do this. So that's kind of the serverless offerings. Now, there's a huge number of different types of service available. Another really popular one right now, if you think about kind of these VMSS and all these other things, is actually Azure Virtual Desktop. And I can really think about this as the idea of publishing a session. I get a complete desktop environment and or an application. I just want to see the pixels from a particular window. And it's obviously very popular with all the pandemic, people working from home more. What Azure Virtual Desktop does is just like kind of AKS, where that control and data plane, well, there's a whole set of components I need for a virtual desktop solution. I need a broker to say where to go to. I need to encapsulate RDP and HTTPS. There's feeds. There's a whole bunch of management. So all that management side is just part of Azure Virtual Desktop. What I then get is a bunch of VMs that are actually my hosts. And they can run different images. I can run server. I can run client. I can run a multi-session client, which is unique to Azure Virtual Desktop. But it's going to provide me an environment where I can host that complete virtual desktop solution. So that's really kind of a key service. So hey, I want to be able to stand up a virtual desktop environment in Azure. What should I use? It's probably going to be Azure Virtual Desktop. One other key service I want to talk about before we move on to a new type of service. For really anything in Azure, but especially if I'm creating my own services, often we have the idea that I have some sensitive information. Now, maybe that sensitive information is a secret. Maybe it's a password or a signature thing I need to be able to write and get back. Sometimes I have keys. I want to perform some cryptographic operation against this thing. Sometimes I have certificates. And I need to be able to manage the life cycle of those. I need to actually be able to also distribute them. How do I store these in a secure manner? And then how do I get access to them? So in Azure, we have Azure Key Vault. So Azure Key Vault enables me to host all of these different types of entity. And there's full granularity. So I can either do this using access policies, or the new way, which is better, is role-based access control. Policies only let me say at a vault level, these people could do this to type secrets, but I couldn't do individual secrets or keys or certificates. RBAC at an individual secret level lets me control who can do what and how it can use it. But the whole point is this provides, if necessary, a hardware security module-backed service for the storage and use of these. So a secret, hey, I can write it, I can read it back out. A key, I can generate it or import it and then perform cryptographic operations, but I cannot export it. Certificates, it will help manage the lifecycle and distribute those to other services. Then I can set RBACs so other services can leverage this. And what's super common is you combine this with something called managed identity. Now that's outside the scope of this, but think about all of these different types of resources, especially VMs or app services or AKS. They can have an identity that's that resource, nothing else can use it. Well, I could give that identity permissions to certain secrets and keys, so I never have to store something in my code. Because I'm running as that app service, I'm allowed to read that secret, which then gives me access maybe to something else. So Key Vault is really that key service when I have any kind of consideration for, hey, I need to store a secret or a key or certificate. Hey, that can then integrate with everything else. So that's really an important one to understand. I talked about networking a couple of times. So all these different services, maybe they're just public facing, but often they need to integrate and work with other things. So we have this idea of a virtual network. Now we talked about regions, we talked about subscriptions. The virtual network, if I think about a certain subscription, within a subscription, I can use lots of different regions. Well, a virtual network exists within a certain subscription and a certain region. It cannot span regions, it cannot span subscriptions. So I can go ahead and create a virtual network. Now, a virtual network is defined by a group of minimum IPv4 address ranges. So I'm going to have at least one, or I can have multiple IPv4 address ranges. It's very common that you use RFC 1918. So that's just a set of IP addresses that will never route over the internet. You might see kind of 10/8. You might see 172/16/12 and 192.168/16. So those are reserved. So I can use, everyone could use that internally because they can't route over the internet. They can't mess with other companies. Now, when I pick the IP range for my virtual network, though, I need to make sure I pick an IP range that doesn't conflict with another virtual network I have or another network I have. For example, if I have on premises, well, I may want to connect these. So I need to make sure I pick an IP range that does not conflict with any other VNet or any other network, be it another cloud or on premises, I may want to ever connect them. So I want to make sure I have this unique IP range. I can optionally add IPv6 ranges as well. That's completely optional. It's always dual stack if I have IPv6. It's never just IPv6. It'll be IPv4 and IPv6. Now within the virtual network, I create virtual subnets. We subnet 1, 2, 3, etc. And they will have an IP range assigned to them, and optionally IPv6. It's going to be a subset of this range. So maybe this is 10.0.0.1/0, 10.0.2. 10.0.3. Whatever. So it's a subset of the IP range of the virtual network. So I divide it up. Remember that regions could consist of multiple availability zones. These span availability zones. So if there was, I think about AZ1, AZ2, and AZ3, they all span. So a subnet is not bound to a particular AZ. It spans all the AZs in the region. So there's no worry about that. For any subnet I create, I always lose 5 IP addresses because generally just the protocol, I always lose kind of the first and the last address, all zeros, all ones of the host range. Then we lose 1 for the gateway, and then we lose 2 for DNS. So whatever address space size I create, remember we always lose 5. And then I create resources inside here, and they will get an IP address allocated from the IP range of the subnet. If I have multiple virtual networks, so let's have another VNet over here, could be the same region or a different region, I can peer them. So peering will route them over the Azure backbone, but now everything can just talk to each other. They cannot overlap. So again, make sure the IP ranges are always unique. I can also connect. I drew the idea of an on-premises network. So I could connect to my on-premises network. What we would do is we would actually create a gateway device. So I could create a VPN gateway device that would let me then over the internet create a tunnel. So obviously I would have gateway devices here as well. And then I establish that tunnel. So this would be a site-to-site VPN. It's encrypted. There are 2 types. There's policy. Policy enables me to have basically one connection. And we typically don't like it. It's a static route. It's really only for a legacy VPN gateway. What we like is route-based. So route-based is I can have n number of connections, and it supports point-to-site VPN, so I can have a particular machine hanging off to just connect a machine to it. And that is actually using separate multiple tunnels, and then has different encryption based on the particular tunnel I have. But this connection is going over the internet, but it is encrypted. The other option is if you think about Microsoft has this huge backbone network, well, I can actually have a private connection. So I could essentially have a connection that goes kind of like this. It's a different type of gateway. So it's an express route gateway, and there's different sizes and SKUs. But this is now express route. It is not going over the internet. This is a private connection. Now that private connection could be because I'm hosted at a colo facility, a co-location, and they have connectivity and I use theirs. It could be I have an MPLS and any-to-any IPVN, and now Azure becomes a point off of that, so that would be a layer 3. It could be I actually have a new network cable dropped to a certain meet me location appearing point, so a layer 2 connection. So there are different types, but express route basically gives me a private connection, so not over the internet, between my on-premises and that virtual network going through that gateway. When I have express route, it's actually different types of traffic. What I drew here, when it was actually going to a network, is something called private peering. I'm connecting it to a virtual network. There's also Microsoft peering, where I can offer services that don't live in a virtual network. So this is great. We have this virtual network. What about if I want to control the flow of traffic? So if I want to restrict maybe between subnets, maybe between VNets, maybe between on-premises, to control the flow of traffic, I can create something called a network security group, an NSG. So an NSG is built around a series of properties. So I can think about the source and the destination IP or CIDR range. I can think about the source and the destination port. I can think about the protocol, i.e. TCP, UDP. And then we have things like, hey, the name, description, a priority, because I have multiple rules, because this is all basically made up of rules. And then, well, do I allow or do I deny? So I create a series of rules based on basically the IP addresses, and then I link them to subnets. I can link it directly to a VM. It's very hard to manage that way. So typically we create these sets of rules that control the flow of traffic and then link it to a subnet. Now I wrote IP address ranges here. Sometimes when I'm talking about Azure services, there's just a huge range of different IP ranges they may use. So the other thing you can do here is something called service tags. So a service tag represents a set of IPs used by a particular Azure service, like Azure Storage in South Central US. Another thing I can do is something called an ASG, an application security group. This is really just a tag that I can put on a network adapter. So instead of having to worry about what IP address something is, I can say, hey, look, if this NIC is tagged with SQL, then treat it as the SQL rules and apply it. But think about NSGs are the way to control the flow of traffic. Now, all of these things I talked about, these are basically layer 4, i.e. it understands TCP and UDP. What about if I want to be able to control based on a fully qualified domain name or a path, the URL? I want to understand SSL. I want to do SSL offloading, affinity. So then we get into other types of service. Now, one of these is something called Azure Firewall. So this is an Azure first-party network virtual appliance. And the big deal about this is it understands yes, it has the idea of that layer 4. I can do network rules. But I can also do application rules, which is kind of that layer 7. So that lets me do rules based on the path, based on the fully qualified domain name. I can have categories based on it can understand what it's talking to. With the premium offerings, it can even do SSL understanding, get in the middle of the SSL conversation, decrypt the traffic to know what's happening over the SSL paths as well. It can do things like DNAT, so I can have a single IP coming in and then send it to particular VMs or services on the other side. So I can do DNAT as well. So Azure Firewall would be kind of the answer, hey, I need to do controls based around fully qualified domain names or categories of web traffic, or I want to be able to host an IP and send to different VMs based on the pool. Hey, Azure Firewall is going to be your answer there. Now, to use Azure Firewall, we basically have to tell the traffic to go to the Azure Firewall as part of its journey. So what typically we would do is, hey, if I wanted to use Azure Firewall, we have something called user-defined routes. And user-defined route just lets me say a next hop. So as on your way to this destination, hey, your next hop is, for example, that virtual appliance. So it lets me change how traffic gets routed around. Now, there are many types of service that actually don't live inside of virtual networks. Let's go to this virtual network for a second. So this virtual network, well, it has, just like the others, a subnet. But imagine now I'm using a storage account over here. Say storage account 1. And I want to be able to say that storage account actually has its own kind of firewall. And I want to say only things in this subnet, subnet 1, are allowed to use that storage account. But I can't do that. By default, it only understands public IP addresses, and this is a private IP range. So what we can do is we can enable a subnet with something called a service endpoint. And it's specific to a certain service. So I would add a service endpoint, let's say, for storage. That does two things. It now gives me a better route in terms of getting to the service, but it also now, on the firewall of that service, I can now say, hey, let's say this is VNet 1. As part of its rules, I can now say VNet 1, subnet 1. Yeah, you're allowed to come in. So the service endpoint now makes this subnet known to that type of service, so I can enable it on its firewall. So now that route would actually, still going through there, and it has an optimal route, but it's going to get checked and will be allowed through. But it's only for things in that subnet. Connected networks, other subnets, it would not work. Service endpoint is only for things that exist in that subnet, i.e. a VM or an AKS or whatever that might be. What about, though, if, well, let's have another storage account. I want to also be able to use it from other networks. So another thing we can do is we can add something called a private endpoint. And what that does is it's actually an IP address in this subnet that points to a specific version of a service. And the benefit here is it's just an IP address, and there's some associated DNS as well. But it's an IP address, and so now what's actually going to happen is anything, hey, I'm peered, hey, I'm on premises, and I'm using transit routing, whatever that might be, it's just an IP, and now I could restrict, I could say, hey, don't allow the public IP at all. I'm only going to allow connectivity coming in through that private endpoint. So these are really useful things to help control the traffic. One final thing when I think about networks, so these are all private IP addresses, but we can add public IPs, maybe to a load balancer or something else. As soon as we add any kind of public way in, some public endpoint to something, there are mean people. There are mean people out there who want to do things like distributed denial of service attack, who can try and target that. By default, for any public IP, Azure has a basic distributed denial of service offering. That at a huge scale, it will redirect that traffic, but it's at a huge scale. Now, maybe my service, I want to be more sensitive, and a much lower value, I want to start working. So Azure has both that basic, but also a standard offering of a DDoS protection service. And what I can get with standard is I create a standard plan, and I can link that plan to multiple virtual networks that will then get that protection for any public IP that's linked to something in that virtual network. And the big differences are, if we go and look at the site, well, here I can see, okay, so it's protection standard overview. I see what I get with the free offering is really just the first two. So yes, it's active traffic monitoring and always on detection and automatic attack mitigations, but only at like a massive, massive scale. But then for the DDoS protection standard, I get this availability guarantee, cost protection, policies tuned to the customer apps that will use machine learning to actually understand normal patterns, which will let it respond even quicker when there's something outside. I can get reporting of exactly what happened. I can see detailed metrics. So when I think really, really large scale, then that DDoS standard is probably something I would want to look at. So if I see a question, hey, I want DDoS protection that's tuned to my application, hey, DDoS standard is probably going to be that right thing. So that's all of the different networking things that we're going to focus on. Now let's think about some of the data side of the house. Because often we want some kind of persistent storage. So great, we've got these various compute services that we're going to build on top of. We have those networking concepts, but hey, I need to store stuff. So how do we think about that? Let's come over here. So the most basic building block we have when we think about